I am excited to welcome up our first storyteller, Jim Tankersley. Jim has a story about changing a question he'd always asked himself.
Thanks, Megan. So excited to be here, and thanks for letting me tell my story. Most kids don't grow up wanting to be an economics reporter, and I certainly didn't. It was not my goal. But looking back, I think there were some signs that maybe it was in the cards for me. I was the only kid I knew who took the players on his stuffed animal baseball teams and imputed them into a database on his Apple computer. And for that matter, the only kid I know who spent a lot of time playing a game on that computer called Lemonade Stand, which was basically just supply and demand over and over and over in the course of the summer when you learn the right pricing for how to sell lemonade to kids on hot days. But I think really maybe the thing that drove me most to my job was just being a kid in Western Oregon in the 1980s and the 1990s and watching an entire economic ladder snap out from underneath the kids I went to high school with. Oregon has been a timber state for a long time, but in the 80s and 90s, the industry basically collapsed. And the guys I went to high school with, who so often had dads or moms who worked in the industry, in the woods or in the mills or in the connected supply businesses, suddenly a blue collar, good paying, middle class pathway that had been open to those kids who weren't going to go to a 4-year college was taken away almost overnight as the industry cratered around them. And I thought about that a lot. I think way more than I might have expected from a teenager or even a preteen. And I think a big reason why is because one other sort of weird thing about me as a kid, I was the kid who in church, in our Episcopal church, would, when the sermon started going long, thumb through the back of the prayer book, which had some pretty amazing poetry, basically, of prayers for various occasions. And one that really stuck with me was called The Prayer for the Oppressed. And it ends with an exhortation to the Lord to help all people receive their fair share of the riches of this land. And for me, I spent a childhood and adolescence wondering, when are the kids I go to high school with going to get their fair share? When is the economy going to start working for these guys who have watched their opportunity dry up? Now, fast forward, I left my largely white hometown. I went to college. I got a job, and I started moving across the country. I was a political reporter in Ohio, and I was about to become a father, and I was chasing a Senate candidate and a gubernatorial candidate all around the state. And I found myself in one of those Ohio river towns that has been sort of husked out by the deindustrialization of the Midwest. It was a sort of place where a crowd had gathered and on a sparkly day along the Ohio River. And they were all waiting for a politician to come out. And he was going to tell them the only thing they really wanted to hear, which was, how was he going to bring the good jobs back? And I started listening to that politician and the answers he was giving, and I realized something. He didn't have real answers. He was just selling them the same warmed over platitudes they'd heard for a really long time. And it set me off on a quest, an expanded version of that childhood question, which now encompassed far more workers in America, which was, when will the good jobs come back? When will the American economy start working again for the people, the working people who built our middle class? So a few years later, I'm living in Washington. Now I work for a magazine, and I'm a full-time economics reporter for the first time in my career. And as part of my job, I spent a lot of time reading through arcane economics research, hoping to find scoops buried in the equations. In this particular moment, I was in my office, which was in the Watergate office building, not the famous Nixon one, but just a couple over. And I found this paper with a really dry title that almost slapped me across the face. It was called "The Allocation of the Allocation of Talent and U.S. Economic Growth," which doesn't sound like a barn burner, but it had this wild finding at the core of it, which was that essentially everything that I thought I knew about the American middle class, the things I had been told in my largely white high school, was incomplete, and that a huge driver, 40% of America's growth since 1960, came not from Leave It to Beaver type ward cleavers coming home into their white families in the suburbs, but from the entry of women and of Black men into the workforce and into opportunities they had been barred from for their entire lives, for the entirety of America. Basically, until 1960, almost all of the high skilled, high paying jobs in the country were walled off to everyone except white men. And then, in the aftermath of a war effort that had pulled women into necessary jobs and had gotten them into the labor force, and then in the hard struggle of civil rights, uh, Americans who had been denied opportunity started to win it. And when they did, an amazing thing happened, which was the entire economy worked better. When you have talented people who have been kept out of deploying their talents to their full extent for so long, and you finally let them do that, it turns out to be really good for how your economy grows. And when it grows fast and unemployment is low, like it was at that time, you get sustained income growth, which pulled millions of Americans into the middle class. And I realized, hey, I've been asking the wrong question this whole time. It's not just when is the economy going to work for the guys I went to high school with or the people of Ohio. It's when is the economy going to start working again for everyone? And where are we going to find the people who can make it work that way again? Where is that new realm of opportunity? And I found it, at least in a microcosm, in a man named Ed Green. Now it's the last day of the minor league baseball season in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, start of September. And my son is now 7, and he has come with me to meet this tall Black man who was walking down the concourse to shake our hands and tell us about what is now his second full-time job of the day. Ed had gotten up before dawn to lay tar on a highway for the state of North Carolina, and now he was a custodian for the Winston-Salem minor league baseball team who scrubbed soda out of the concrete. He spent some time telling my son why that was so difficult, and then my son spent the rest of the game telling me not to spill our sodas. So I met Ed, and I wrote about him, a man who had once had a good middle-class job, had to give it up, and now had to work 2 full-time jobs just to give his kids the middle-class lifestyle that he wanted for them, that the American economy used to deliver, but had stopped delivering for workers like Ed. And I wrote about him in a story for the Washington Post, and then we kept in touch. And over time, I learned that Ed's family was, in fact, a perfect encapsulation of this middle-class rise and fall in America. His mother had grown up in one of 16 kids in Winston-Salem and had made her way north in the Great Migration. And she and his father had worked hard and built a middle-class life in Queens, New York for their kids. And now Ed, who had not gone to college, was being kicked backwards by an economy that first had just shifted out from under him. And then, the last time we talked, he was starting to see signs of discrimination reforming, of new barriers being thrown up for Black men, for women of all races, that are holding our economy back. And this normally would be the part of an economics reporter's time with you, where he would tell you how we fix all this. Because the great news in Ed's story, in the American story, is I've learned by changing my focus, by asking this question about all workers, that we have the raw materials right here for another middle-class golden age like we had after World War II. We just need to empower workers like Ed and like his children. We need more women working and in higher value jobs and getting paid more for what they're worth. And we need more immigrants and workers of color to be able to have the opportunities that white men do. And I would like to tell you that's going to be easy, but actually it's going to be really hard. I basically have concluded that the single best thing that we could do as a country for our economy, let alone for the justness of where we live, is to sustain and finish the work of civil rights to end systemic racism and sexism. But I know that's not a 5-point plan. That's not something you're going to hear from a politician on a stump speech as an easy way to fix things. And I'll tell you, I actually think that one of the most important lessons I've learned in my life is that that's okay. And I learned it in college from a man who also embodies the type of progression that I've just been talking to you about. His name was Bill Wu, and he was the son of a Chinese immigrant to America, and he had risen to become the editor-in-chief of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch newspaper, but he had retired, and he taught my intro to journalism class. And Bill would spend hours regaling us with stories of the right way to do journalism and the right way to be a human being. And he would scrawl notes in our assignments, which I've kept all of them because they were so much wisdom. And like that prayer book uh, from so long ago, it was like poetry. And the one that I think of every day that was scrawled at the end of an assignment I had turned in, Bill told me that he hoped I held something with me always. There are no quick fixes ever for the things we hold dearest. Thank you. That's my lesson learned.